Clara Bennett did not knock. She pushed open the door of Whitmore Hall with both hands, a bundle of mended clothes pressed to her chest mud on her boots, and 3 days of grief still raw behind her eyes. 30 women in silk dresses turned to stare. A servant stepped forward to stop her. But the man at the far end of the room, the man every family in Virginia wanted their daughter to marry, raised one hand. "Let her stay," Nathaniel Whitmore said. Nobody understood why. Not yet. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1817 came to Virginia, the way trouble always came to that county, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. The heat settled over the rolling fields like a second skin. The James River ran low and brown. Farmers who had already lost half a season to drought stood at their fences and watched the sky with the particular exhaustion of men who had stopped expecting mercy from it. But inside Whitmore Hall, the air was cool. The windows were tall, and the ceilings were high, and the rugs beneath every well-shod foot had been imported from places most of the county had never heard of. Crystal glasses caught the morning light and threw small rainbows across the walls. The women seated along the edges of the grand sitting room wore their finest summer muslins. They had arrived in carriages. They had been received by servants. They had been offered refreshments on silver trays. They had not been told what they were really being evaluated for. Nathaniel Whitmore stood near the fireplace, though no fire burned in it on a morning this warm. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair and a face that had been called handsome so many times by so many people that the word had long since stopped meaning anything to him. He held a glass of water he had not touched. He was watching the door. He had been watching the door since the first woman arrived at 9 o'clock that morning. His attorney, a thin man named Gerald Fitch, who wore his spectacles at the very end of his nose, leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "That is the 29th Mr. Whitmore, Miss Harriet Langston from the Langston tobacco family. Her mother says she speaks French and paints watercolors." "I didn't ask what she paints," Nathaniel said. Gerald cleared his throat. "No, sir. Of course not. The process had been simple. Each woman was shown into the room. Each was offered a seat. Each was given the same question. And each without exception had given an answer that told Nathaniel exactly what he did not want to know about them. Miss Harriet Langston smoothed her skirt and smiled. She had practiced the smile, he could tell. "Miss Langston," Nathaniel said, "I have one question for you." "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. A child no more than 8 years old is caught stealing bread from your kitchen during the coldest week Virginia has seen in 20 years. Your estate manager tells you the child must be punished publicly, made an example of. He says if you show mercy, every tenant on your land will see weakness." He paused. "What do you do?" Harriet Langston did not hesitate. "I would defer to my husband's judgment naturally, but I would privately ensure the child received a warm meal before any consequence was given." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you, Miss Langston." She left smiling, certain she had said the right thing. Gerald marked something in his ledger. "That is 29, he said again, quieter this time. "I heard you the first time, Gerald." "Sir, the Whitmore name requires—" "The Whitmore name," Nathaniel said, setting his untouched glass on the mantelpiece, "has been used to justify a great many things I'm still reckoning with. Don't lecture me about it this morning." Gerald fell silent. The door opened. The 30th woman entered. She was the daughter of a federal land commissioner, and she wore pearls at her throat and moved with the kind of careful grace that had been drilled into her since childhood. She was beautiful. She was composed. She answered the question about the hungry child by saying she would forgive him, donate a basket of food to his family, and then consult the local minister about the moral failing that had driven a child to theft. Nathaniel thanked her. She left. The room was empty except for Gerald, 2 servants standing near the door, and the particular silence of a man who had spent an entire morning listening to 30 different versions of the same wrong answer. "Shall I close the ledger?" Gerald asked. "Not yet." "Sir, there is no 31st appointment. The list is finished. I know. Gerald opened his mouth. Then he closed it. The front door opened. Not with ceremony. Not with announcement. It opened the way a working woman opens a door when she has work to do and very little patience left for the world's opinion of her. Clara Bennett stepped into the entrance hall with a bundle of mended garments folded over both arms and mud caking the sides of her boots from the long walk up the lane. Her dress was the color of a faded summer sky, once blue, now something closer to the color of exhaustion. Her hair was pinned up, but not perfectly. A strand had come loose along her jaw. She was 26 years old, and she looked like a woman who had not slept well in several days. One of the servants moved to intercept her. Delivery entrance is around the back, miss. I know where the delivery entrance is, Clara said, her voice even not unkind. But the housekeeper told me to bring Mr. Whitmore's shirts directly on account of the collar stitching she wanted him to see before she paid the remainder. That may be, but this isn't the time. Let her stay. The voice came from the far doorway. Every head turned. Nathaniel Whitmore stood with one hand braced against the doorframe watching her. Several of the women who had been lingering in the entrance hall, waiting for their carriages, adjusting their gloves, pretending not to be curious, looked at Clara Bennett with expressions that moved between confusion and contempt. One of them, a woman named Mrs. Alderton, whose family owned the largest grist mill in the county, made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She's the seamstress, Mrs. Alderton said to the woman beside her, just loud enough to be heard. Clara heard it. She did not look at Mrs. Alderton. She looked at Nathaniel Whitmore. I can leave the shirts with your housekeeper if this is a bad time, sir, she said. It's no trouble. Stay, he said again. Then after a pause that felt longer than it was, please. The please surprised her. She could see that it surprised Gerald too, who looked up sharply from his ledger. Clara stayed. She set the bundle of shirts carefully on a side table near the door where a servant would find them. Then she stood, hands folded in front of her, and waited with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Nathaniel crossed the room toward her. He was taller than she'd expected, or perhaps it was just the way he moved deliberately without waste, the way men moved when they were used to every room adjusting itself around them. Miss Bennett, he said. She looked up at him steadily. Mr. Whitmore? You are William Bennett's daughter. Something shifted in her expression. Not pain exactly, something older than pain, something that had already moved past the worst of it and come out on the other side. I am, she said. Your father worked as an accountant for this estate. He did, for 11 years. Nathaniel studied her for a moment. I have a question I've been asking people this morning. I'd like to ask it of you as well, if you're willing. Clara glanced briefly at the women still lingering near the entrance. She was perfectly aware of what she looked like in that room. She had grown up being aware of what she looked like in rooms. You can ask, she said. He asked her the same question he had asked 30 times that morning. The child, the bread, the coldest winter, the estate manager demanding punishment. What would she do? The room had gradually gone quiet. People who had been moving toward the door had stopped without quite meaning to. Gerald held his pen above the ledger, but didn't write. Clara listened to the question without changing her expression. When he finished, she didn't answer immediately. She looked at her own hands for a moment. Then she looked back up at him. Before I answer what I'd do about the child stealing bread, she said, I'd want to know why a child on my property was hungry enough to steal. Nathaniel said nothing. Clara continued, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the still room. Because a hungry child in your kitchen isn't the first crime, Mr. Whitmore. It's the evidence of one. Someone failed that child before he ever touched your bread. Could have been the weather. Could have been his father's debts. Could have been a landlord who took too much and left too little. She paused. Could have been the estate manager himself. Mrs. Alderton made another small sound. This one was less amused. I wouldn't punish the child, Clara said. I'd feed him first. Then I'd sit down with my accounts and figure out how a child in my care got hungry enough to risk punishment just to eat. Because if that happened once, it happened before. And if it happened before, I missed it. And that's on me. The silence in the room was different from all the silences that had come before it. Nathaniel looked at her for a long, measured moment. "Miss Bennet," he said, "every woman I spoke to this morning answered a question about a child. You're the first one who answered a question about a household." Clara met his gaze. "With respect, Mr. Whitmore, they're the same question." Behind him, Gerald had stopped pretending to write. One of the women near the door, young, barely 20, from a good Charleston family, was watching Clara with an expression that looked almost like recognition. Mrs. Alderton, for her part, had gone very still. Nathaniel glanced at Gerald. Something passed between them, a look that Gerald clearly found uncomfortable. "Would you be willing to sit down for a moment, Miss Bennet?" Nathaniel asked. "There are some things I'd like to speak with you about." Clara looked at the room. She looked at the silk dresses and the pearl earrings and the expressions on the faces of women who had spent the morning being evaluated and had not expected even for a moment to be outshone by the seamstress who came in through the wrong door. "All right," she said. The servants pulled back a chair at the side table, and Clara sat down in it with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. Not performance, not defiance. Just the particular uprightness of a woman who had nothing to prove, and had learned the hard way that she didn't need to. What followed was not the conversation Gerald had scripted. It was not the polite, structured interview that had produced 29 careful and useless answers. It was something that looked more like two people who had been standing in the same room for years without knowing it, and had only just now turned to face each other. Nathaniel pulled a chair across from her, not behind a desk, not at the head of the table. Across from her. Level. Gerald made a faint noise of professional distress and said nothing. "Your father," Nathaniel said, his voice lower now, less formal. "How long ago did you lose him?" 4 years, Clara said. "This July." "I was sorry to hear it. He was well regarded on this estate." Something moved through Clara's eyes. Not gratitude, something more complicated. "He was," she said carefully. "Until he wasn't." Nathaniel leaned back slightly. "What does that mean?" She looked at him. She was deciding something. He could see her deciding it. "My father spent 11 years keeping accurate books for the Whitmore estate," she said. "He was proud of that work. He was meticulous. He believed that a man who kept honest accounts was providing an honest service, and that an honest service was worth something." "It is." "In the last year before he died, he found something in the accounts that didn't match," Clara said. "Numbers that had been moved, payments that had been recorded twice, relief funds that had been allocated on paper but never delivered." The room had gone very quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience, the held breath quiet of something about to crack. "He brought it to the estate manager," Clara said. "Charles Everett." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, barely perceptibly, but she noticed. "Everett told him he had misread the records," she said. "Told him he was tired, overworked, that the numbers were correct, and my father was confused. My father was not a man who was easily confused. He went back and looked again, and again. And then he came home one evening and told my mother that he was going to bring the discrepancy to your father's attention directly." "He never did," Nathaniel said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Clara said. "He never did. He fell ill 3 weeks later. The kind of ill where a healthy man loses 20 pounds in 2 months and can't hold water down. The doctor called it a fever." She looked at her hands again. "My mother always called it something else." The silence was absolute. "After he died," Clara continued, "Mr. Everett came to our house. He told my mother that my father had borrowed against his wages, that there was a debt. He produced a document. My mother couldn't read it. Her eyes had always been poor, but she signed it because Mr. Everett told her it was a formality. 2 weeks later, we received notice that our home was no longer ours." "You lost your house," Nathaniel said. "We lost our house, our garden. The money my father had set aside for my younger brother's schooling, and most of what my father had worked for across 11 years of honest service." She said it plainly without performance. "My mother took in sewing. I learned alongside her. My brother works at the mill now. He's 14. Gerald, who had been standing completely still near the back wall, quietly set his pen down on the table. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment. His face was very still, the way a man's face goes still when he's holding something down with both hands. "Miss Bennet," he said at last. "Yes, sir." "Do you still have your father's papers?" Clara looked at him, really looked at him, not the searching look of someone hoping for rescue, but the careful measuring look of someone who has been disappointed by powerful men before and is determining whether this one is different. "Some of them," she said finally. "He kept copies, in habit. He said a careful accountant always keeps his own record of what he submits." "Where are they?" She didn't answer immediately. "Why do you ask?" "Because," Nathaniel said, and his voice had changed. It had dropped the formal distance and become something closer to the truth beneath it. "My brother died 14 months ago, and before he died, he wrote me a letter. A letter I haven't been able to make sense of. He said there was something wrong in the estate accounts, something that had been wrong for years. He said he was going to bring it to me directly." He paused. "He never finished the letter." Clara went very still. "He fell ill," she said slowly. "Yes." Quickly. "Very." They looked at each other across the small table in the cooling sitting room, and the thing that passed between them was not romantic. It was not the comfortable electricity of a drawing room flirtation. It was something much more uncomfortable, the recognition that two people who had been moving through separate griefs had arrived without knowing it at the same door. "Mr. Everett was close to your brother as well?" Clara asked. "He managed everything for my father for 30 years. He has managed everything for me for the last 4. Nathaniel's voice was very controlled. "I trusted him completely." Clara let that sit for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer." "Ask." "Do you want to know the truth? Whatever it is, wherever it leads, even if it costs you something to know it." He looked at her without flinching. "I reckon I've been paying for not knowing it long enough." Clara nodded slowly. "Then yes, I still have my father's papers." Outside the window, a carriage rolled away down the lane. Then another. The parade of silk dresses and family names and practiced smiles was dispersing into the summer heat, climbing into their waiting vehicles, returning to their estates, their parlors, their certainties. Mrs. Alderton was the last to leave. She paused in the doorway of the sitting room, looked at the two figures seated across from each other at the small table, the wealthy landowner and the seamstress in the faded blue dress, and made a sound very low in her throat. "This is irregular," she announced to no one in particular. Neither of them looked up. Mrs. Alderton left. Gerald cleared his throat. "Sir, the morning's appointments are finished," Nathaniel said. "Thank you, Gerald." Gerald looked at Clara. He looked at his ledger with its 30 careful entries. He looked at Nathaniel. "Shall I close the ledger?" he asked. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "And send for Mrs. Hale. Tell her Miss Bennet will be staying for tea." Gerald's eyebrows rose above the frame of his spectacles by a remarkable distance. He said nothing. He closed the ledger. He left. The sitting room was quiet. Clara looked around it at the high ceilings, the crystal light, the long shadows of a summer morning moving slowly across expensive floors. "I ain't the kind of person you invite to tea in a place like this," she said matter of fact. "Maybe not," Nathaniel said. "But you're the only person who came through that door today who told me the truth. So you're the only person I want to talk to." She considered that. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "My father spent 11 years being honest in this house. It didn't protect him." "No," he said quietly. "It didn't. And that is something I intend to answer for." She looked at him for a long time, with that careful, measuring look, that accounting look, the same look her father must have turned on columns of numbers that refused to reconcile. She was adding something up. Finally, she nodded. Just once. Small and decisive. "All right," she said. "Tea. And then we talk about the papers." Outside, the summer heat pressed down on Virginia like a hand. The fields baked and the river ran low, and 30 carriages carried 30 women with 30 rehearsed answers back to their comfortable lives. Inside Whitmore Hall, a seamstress in a faded blue dress and a man who owned half the county sat down at a small table with the particular gravity of two people who had just realized they were standing at the edge of something that could not be unknitted. Neither of them knew yet how deep the roots of it went. But both of them were beginning to suspect. And somewhere in the back of the house, in a locked room off the estate office that Nathaniel had never had reason to enter, a set of ledgers sat in a locked chest. Charles Everett had the only key he always had. Tea at Whitmore Hall was not a comfortable affair. Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, set the tray down with the particular care of a woman who had served this family for 22 years and had opinions about everything, including who belonged at which table. She did not say a word. She didn't need to. The way she arranged the cups, Clara's slightly farther from the center of the tray, said everything her mouth declined to. Clara noticed. She always noticed things like that. You learn to when you grew up on the edge of rooms you weren't supposed to be in. She wrapped both hands around her cup and let the warmth of it ground her. Nathaniel was watching Everett's name settle between them like a stone dropped into still water, watching the rings move outward, calculating how far they'd reach. "Tell me about the papers," he said. "Specifically, what did your father keep?" "Copies of every ledger entry he submitted to the estate office," Clara said. "Monthly, for 11 years. He kept them in a tin box under the floorboard in his study. He told me once, I was maybe 15, he said, 'Clara, an honest man keeps his own record. Not because he plans to use it, but because honesty ought to be able to prove itself if it ever has to.' Did he ever think it would have to? Not until that last year." She set her cup down. "He found a pattern. Not one big theft, nothing so obvious. It was small. A few dollars here. A relief allocation recorded but never dispersed. A land payment credited twice to the same family's debt. Separately, each one looked like a clerical error. Together, it was a system," Nathaniel said. "Yes." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "How much are we talking about?" "My father's estimate, and he was careful he didn't put a number down unless he was certain, was somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 over a decade, taken from tenant relief funds, land payment accounts, and what was supposed to be a widow's assistance fund your grandfather established." Nathaniel went very still. "My grandfather established a widow's fund. Your father continued it. It was meant to provide small payments to women who lost husbands on Whitmore land farming accidents mostly. $20 a year. Not much, but enough." Clara's voice was steady, quiet. "My father tracked 23 women who should have received payments over the years he worked here. He found records of 11 payments. The other 12, the money was allocated, entered into the outgoing ledger, and then it just—" She opened her hand. Gone. The sound Nathaniel made was low and involuntary. Not anger, not yet. Something prior to anger. The thing that comes before it, when a man realizes the ground beneath him is not what he thought it was. 12 widows, he said. At minimum. Those are just the ones my father was able to document before he got sick. He stood up. Not dramatically. Not the way men stood in courtrooms when they wanted to project authority. He stood up the way a man stands when the walls of a room have gotten too close and he needs space to think. He walked to the far side of the room and stood with his back to her for a moment. Clara watched him. She did not fill the silence with reassurance. She had learned that too, that some silences needed to be sat in, not smoothed over. "Charles Everett," Nathaniel said to the wall, "has been in this house since I was 7 years old." "I know. My father trusted him absolutely." "I know. My brother—" He stopped. Clara waited. He turned around. His face had the particular controlled look of a man who has decided that falling apart is not something he can afford right now and has made peace with that decision. "My brother's letter," he said. "The one I told you about. He said there was something wrong in the accounts. He'd been reviewing the land records because he was thinking about expanding the eastern acreage. He wanted to be sure of the title chains. and he found something that didn't sit right. He wrote to me in Philadelphia. I was there for business." He paused. "The letter took 2 weeks to reach me. By the time I came home, he was already—" Another pause. "He died 10 days after I arrived." "How old was he?" 29. Clara looked at him. "What did the doctor say?" "Fever, same as your father." His jaw tightened. "Same doctor as it happens, Dr. Aldous Marsh. He's been the estate physician since my grandfather's time." "And Charles Everett recommended him, I imagine?" Nathaniel looked at her sharply. "Yes. How did you know that?" "Because Charles Everett recommends everything that touches this estate," Clara said. "The doctor, the lawyer, the mill contracts, the land surveyors. My father noticed that too. He wrote it down. Mr. Everett is the hub of every wheel on this property. That's the exact phrase he used." She looked at her hands. "He meant it as an observation. Later I understood it as a warning." Nathaniel crossed back to his chair and sat down heavily. "I need to see those papers," he said. "All of them. I know you do." "Can you bring them?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore, I need you to understand something before I hand over the only thing my father left behind that proved he was telling the truth. Tell me, those papers are the reason my family still has anything. Not money, not property, but the knowledge that my father was not wrong, was not confused, was not the man Charles Everett made him out to be after he died." Her voice was steady, but there was iron in it. "Mr. Everett told people my father had been dismissed for sloppy work, for errors. He told people my father had borrowed wages he couldn't repay. He spent 4 years quietly building a version of William Bennett that made everything that happened to us seem like our own fault." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "I didn't know that. I didn't expect you did. Men like Mr. Everett are very careful about what reaches the man at the top of the house." She looked at him directly. "So before I give you those papers, I need to know you're not going to look at them and then hand them to Charles Everett to explain away." The silence that followed was sharp. "Miss Bennett," Nathaniel said, and his voice had lost every trace of drawing-room formality. "Charles Everett may have killed my brother. I assure you I will not be handing him anything." Clara held his gaze, measuring, weighing. Then she nodded. "I'll bring them tomorrow morning," she said. "Early, before the house is fully awake. I'd rather fewer people knew about it. I'll be up at 6. "Good." She stood smoothing her skirt in a practical, unself-conscious way. "Then I'll see you at 6. She picked up her shawl from the back of the chair. At the door she paused. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked up. "My father was the most honest man I ever knew," she said. "He believed that doing the right thing was its own protection. He was wrong about that, but I'd still like it to count for something." She held his gaze for one steady moment. "I'd appreciate it if you made it count." She left before he could answer. Nathaniel sat alone in the cooling room for a long time after the sound of her footsteps faded. Then he got up and went to find Gerald. Gerald was in the estate office doing what Gerald always did when he was unsettled, reorganizing papers that did not need reorganizing. He looked up when Nathaniel entered and immediately recognized the expression on the man's face. "Gerald," Nathaniel said, closing the door behind him. "I need you to pull every land transaction record from the past 15 years, everything touching the Eastern tenant parcels, the relief fund allocations, and the widow's assistance account." Gerald went very still. "Sir, those records are maintained by Mr. Everett's." "I know who maintains them. I'm asking you to pull them." "Mr. Everett has the keys to the secondary archive. Then I'll need you to get them from him. Tell him I'm doing a routine review before the fall tax assessments. Don't tell him anything else." Gerald's face had the look of a man standing on a bridge who has just heard an ominous creak beneath him. "Is there something I should be aware of, sir?" Nathaniel looked at him. Gerald Fitch had been his father's attorney before he was Nathaniel's. He was meticulous, cautious, and fundamentally decent in the way that men who spent their lives handling other people's money sometimes were out of sheer professional self-preservation. "Not yet," Nathaniel said, "but there may be. I need those records, Gerald. Quietly. Gerald adjusted his spectacles. Of course, sir. And Gerald, don't mention this conversation to Everett. The pause before Gerald answered was brief but real. Understood. Nathaniel left him to it. He went to his brother's room. He hadn't been in it since the funeral. He'd told himself it was grief. Partly it was. But partly he'd known in the part of himself he'd been refusing to listen to that going into that room meant facing the letter. The unfinished letter that had arrived 2 weeks after Thomas wrote it, 3 days after Thomas died, tucked in the middle of a packet of routine estate correspondence. He'd read it once. He'd folded it. He'd put it in the desk drawer. He'd told himself he'd come back to it when he could think clearly. He'd been telling himself that for 14 months. He opened the desk drawer. The letter was still there. 3 pages in Thomas's loose, hurried handwriting Thomas had always written like a man with more thoughts than time sentences running over each other at the edges. Nathaniel carried it to the chair by the window and read it properly for the first time. Thomas had started with the eastern acreage, the land survey he'd been reviewing. He'd found a discrepancy in the title chain on one parcel. A family named Greer had owned it, paid it off over 12 years, and then according to the estate records had defaulted on the final payment and lost the land. But Thomas had found the Greer family's receipt book. They'd kept meticulous records, which showed the final payment had been made, in full, recorded, signed by the estate accountant, by William Bennett. Thomas had gone to Charles Everett about it. Nathaniel's hand tightened on the paper. Everett had told Thomas the same thing he'd told William Bennett years earlier. Confusion, old records, clerical error. He'd been charming about it. Apparently, Thomas's writing turned slightly apologetic at this point, the way it always did when he was second-guessing himself. I may have the wrong of it, Thomas had written. Everett seems very certain, but I can't reconcile the numbers, Nate. I've tried. I keep coming back to the Greer receipt, and I keep... The letter ended there, mid-sentence, mid-thought, as if someone had walked in. Nathaniel set the letter down on his knee and sat very quietly in his dead brother's chair. Outside, somewhere in the distance, he heard a horse on the lane. He heard a door close in the lower part of the house. He heard faintly the ordinary sounds of an estate going about its afternoon, a bell, a voice, the creak of a wagon. All of it managed by Charles Everett. All of it flowing through Charles Everett. He thought about the question he'd asked 30 women that morning. He thought about the child stealing bread. He thought about the answer that had disappointed him 29 times, and then the 30th cut straight through to the truth. Before I ask why the child stole bread, I'd want to know why a child on my property was hungry enough to steal. He thought about 12 widows who should have received $20 a year and hadn't. He thought about the Greer family who had paid off their land and then lost it anyway. He thought about his brother dead at 29 mid-sentence. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. Then he went downstairs to the dinner table where Charles Everett was already seated, already smiling, already asking the kitchen staff whether the lamb would be ready by 7. Charles Everett was 55 years old, broad through the middle with silver hair and the easy manner of a man who had never had reason to be nervous in this house. He'd managed 3 generations of Whitmores. He wore that history like a coat. It fit him perfectly. Nathaniel, he said warmly as Nathaniel took his seat. Good Lord, what a morning you had. 30 women. Your father would have had opinions about that. He would have, Nathaniel agreed. And then the seamstress girl of all things. Mrs. Alderton stopped by on her way out. She was quite put out. Everett chuckled. You know how she is. Can't fault her, though. The Bennett girl at tea is not well. He waved a hand. What on earth prompted that? She said something interesting, Nathaniel said. Seamstresses sometimes do. Occupational hazard of working in silence all day. You get time to think up clever things to say. Everett smiled. What did she say? Nathaniel looked at him across the table. She said a hungry child isn't a crime. It's the evidence of one. Everett laughed. A warm, genuine-sounding laugh. Well, that's rather good. Very poetic. He reached for his bread. Still, you'd do well to be careful there, Nathaniel. The girl is William Bennett's daughter. Her father was a fine accountant until his last year when, frankly, his work became unreliable. I tried to manage it quietly for his family's sake. But the debts were real. The errors were real. I know she may have told you a different version. She did, Nathaniel said evenly. Tell me about the errors. Everett set down his bread. Just for a moment, just 1 second, something moved through his eyes, fast, like a bird crossing a window. Then the ease came back. Nothing dramatic, he said. Entries that didn't reconcile, allocation records that were confused. He was ill toward the end. The mind goes. He shook his head with what looked like sorrow. I hated having to let him go. 23 years, Nathaniel. Your father was fond of him. 11 years, Nathaniel said. Everett looked at him. I'm sorry. Bennett worked here for 11 years, not 23. A pause. Small. Calibrated. Of course, 11 years. I was thinking of his predecessor. Everett smiled again, unruffled. Age. My mind wanders. Does it? Nathaniel said. After dinner, when Everett had retired to his rooms in the West Wing, Nathaniel went back to the estate office where Gerald was still working. Gerald looked up. His spectacles were pushed up on his forehead, which meant he'd been reading closely. It also meant he'd found something. You found something, Nathaniel said. Gerald folded his hands on the desk. I found several things. Some of them have easy explanations, some of them. He took off his spectacles entirely and set them on the desk. In 20 years, Nathaniel had never seen Gerald take off his spectacles voluntarily. Some of them do not. Tell me. The Widow's Assistance Fund, Gerald said. Your grandfather established it in 1801. It was capitalized with $800 and was meant to generate annual disbursements from the interest. I went back through the account ledgers for the last 15 years. He paused. The account was emptied in 1809. The principal. All of it. It was recorded as a transfer to cover an estate debt, a debt I cannot find any record of. Who authorized the transfer? Gerald looked at him steadily. The authorization signature on the transfer record belongs to your father. But Nathaniel, your father, was in Philadelphia in March of 1809. I remember because I traveled with him. He was there for 6 weeks for the Merchant Association hearings. He paused. He could not have signed a document in Virginia in March of 1809. The silence in the room was total. Forgery, Nathaniel said. That would be my assessment. Yes. Nathaniel put both hands flat on the desk and leaned on them. How long have you suspected? I haven't. Not until tonight. Gerald's voice was quiet and very careful. I want to be precise about that, Nathaniel. I did not know. I should perhaps have looked more closely at some points, but I did not know. I believe you, Gerald. Gerald exhaled. There may be more. I'd need time to go through the full archive. But if someone forged your father's signature on the widow's fund transfer, then they could have forged it anywhere, Nathaniel said. Yes. They looked at each other across the desk. I need the full archive, Nathaniel said. Every record going back 20 years. I need it pulled and secured somewhere Everett cannot access it. If I request the archive keys from him tonight, he'll know something is wrong. Then don't ask him for the keys. Nathaniel straightened. My father's personal papers, are they still in the library safe? They should be. He kept duplicates of important estate documents, every year, end of December. It was his habit. Nathaniel moved toward the door. Start there. Tonight. Don't tell anyone. And Everett? Let him have a good night's sleep, Nathaniel said. He's had a long time having them. One more won't hurt. He left Gerald to his work and stepped out into the night air. The summer dark was warm and thick and full of the sound of insects and the distant movement of the river. He stood on the back porch of the house his grandfather had built and looked out at the fields that had been in his family for 60 years. 12 widows. A forged signature. A brother who died mid-sentence. And a seamstress with a tin box of her father's papers under a floorboard. He thought about what Clara had said at the door. My father believed doing the right thing was its own protection. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about it too, Nathaniel realized. He'd believed that because his family had always tried to be decent, generous in lean years, fair with tenants, honest in their dealings. The people they trusted would be decent too. He'd believed the house reflected the values of the man at the top of it. He understood now, standing in the dark, that he had never actually looked. He had trusted. He had inherited trust along with the land and the money and the name, and he had never examined it the way he examined a business contract or a soil assessment. He had trusted, and 12 women had gone without $20 a year because of it, and the Greer family had lost land they'd paid for, and William Bennett had died mid-investigation, and Thomas had died mid-sentence, and Nathaniel had spent 14 months telling himself he'd go back to the letter when he could think clearly. He could think clearly now. He went back inside. At 5:30 in this morning, before the kitchen fires were lit, before the house staff began to move through the halls, Nathaniel was at the small table in the estate library, with Gerald's preliminary findings spread in front of him and his brother's letter beside them. He heard the knock at the side door at 6 exactly. Clara came in without ceremony, as she'd come in everything so far, practically without fuss. She was wearing a different dress today, a darker gray, and she carried a cloth bag that she set on the table, with the particular care of someone transporting something irreplaceable. "You found something last night?" she said, looking at his face. "Several things. Gerald Fitch found a forged signature on a document transferring the widow's fund, dated March 1809. My father was in Philadelphia." Clara went very still. "He didn't just steal from the accounts. He stole your father's name to do it." "Yes." She reached into the cloth bag. She placed a tin box on the table. It was plain dented at one corner with a small latch that had been opened and closed so many times it moved easily. 11 years, she said. Everything he submitted, everything he kept, cross-referenced, dated, signed. She opened the box. Inside were neat stacks of folded paper, organized by year, each stack tied with a piece of ribbon. He wrote notes in the margins, questions he meant to ask, things that didn't add up, things he went back and checked. Nathaniel reached out and carefully lifted the first stack. The handwriting was clear and precise, accountant's handwriting, every number exact, and in the margins, in slightly smaller script, small annotations checked against original. Does not match. Queried with Everett. No satisfactory response. "Miss Bennett," Nathaniel said quietly. "Yes. Your father was not just an honest man." He set the papers down very carefully. "He was a methodical one. This is—" He stopped. "This is evidence. That's what he intended it to be," Clara said. "He just didn't live long enough to deliver it." They sat across from each other in the early morning quiet, the tin box opened between them, 11 years of truth laid out on a table in the house that had swallowed it. "I'm going to need a lawyer," Nathaniel said. "Not Gerald. Gerald is already compromised by proximity to this estate. Someone independent, someone from Richmond or Washington who doesn't have any connection to Everett's network." "My father mentioned a name once," Clara said. "A federal land attorney, a man named Josiah Crane. He handled cases involving fraudulent land transfers. He'd worked against Everett's kind of scheme before. My father wrote the name in his notes." She flipped to the last year's entries and pointed. There in the margin beside a list of questionable allocations in William Bennett's careful hand, Josiah Crane, Richmond. Federal land fraud. Honest man. Nathaniel looked at those 3 words. Honest man. Coming from William Bennett in these circumstances, it was about the highest endorsement available. "I'll send for him today," Nathaniel said, privately. He looked up at her. "This means Everett may be investigated. It may mean a hearing, possibly federal involvement given the forgery and the land fraud." "I know." "It will be public. Your family's name will come up. What happened to your father?" "Good," Clara said quietly. "Let it come up. Let people hear it." She met his gaze, and her eyes were steady and clear and carried the weight of 4 years of knowing the truth and having no one with the power to listen. Let them hear what Charles Everett did to an honest man and his family. Let them hear all of it. Nathaniel held her gaze. Something settled in him. Not relief, not yet. Something more foundational. The particular solidness that comes when a man has finally turned to face the thing he's been carrying and realized it will not crush him. It is heavy, but it can be carried. "I'll have Gerald take Everett on a site inspection of the northern fields this morning," he said. "It'll keep him occupied and away from the office for the day. While he's gone, I want you to help me go through these papers against the estate records Gerald pulled last night." He paused. "If you're willing." Clara looked at the tin box. At 11 years of her father's work finally opened on the right table in front of the right person. "I've been waiting 4 years for someone to ask me that," she said. "Then let's start," Nathaniel said. And they did. They worked through the morning with the particular focused quiet of two people who understood what was at stake. Gerald came and went, setting documents beside them, taking notes in his small, precise hand. Occasionally, one of them would find something, a number that matched a date that aligned a pattern that snapped into place with a soft, terrible clarity, and they'd mark it and move on. By noon, they had documented 7 forged authorizations, 4 fraudulent land transfers, 2 accounts emptied through false debt records, and a pattern of payments to an unnamed Richmond property that Nathaniel did not recognize, and that Gerald confirmed had never appeared in any legitimate estate record. By early afternoon, they had a picture. It was not a pretty one. Charles Everett had been extracting money from the Whitmore estate for at least 12 years, not recklessly, carefully, in amounts small enough to blur into error, through channels complex enough that no single person would see the whole shape of it, using the Whitmore name forged when necessary to legitimize every move. "He's been running a parallel operation," Clara said, looking at the Richmond property payments. "He's been building something. Land, maybe, or capital. Something outside this estate that nobody here knew about." "We need Crane," Nathaniel said. "Today, if possible." He dispatched a rider to Richmond before 2 o'clock. And then at 3:17 in the afternoon, Charles Everett came back from the northern fields early. His voice carried from the entrance hall, that warm, authoritative voice, asking Mrs. Hale where Mr. Whitmore was. Clara looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Clara. He was on his feet before Mrs. Hale could answer. "Stay here," he said to Clara. "Don't move anything. Don't let anyone in." He was in the entrance hall in 30 seconds, cutting Everett off before the man could move toward the library. Everett stopped, looked at him, looked at the direction Nathaniel had come from. "You're back early?" Nathaniel said. His voice was perfectly even. "Gerald said something about records review," Everett said slowly. "I thought I'd come help. Save you the trouble." He smiled. "Those old files can be confusing if you don't know what you're looking at." "I appreciate that," Nathaniel said. "But I think I'm getting the hang of it." They stood in the entrance hall and looked at each other, and in the space between them was something that had been invisible that morning and was now suddenly very clearly visible to both of them. Everett's smile did not falter, but his eyes for just a fraction of a second did something that no amount of charm or practice could quite cover. They calculated. "Of course," Everett said warmly. "I'll be in my office if you need me." He turned and walked away down the hall. Nathaniel watched him go. He heard Everett's office door close. He heard a moment later the particular sound of a drawer opening. He went back to the library and closed the door. Clara looked up. "He knows something's wrong." "Yes." "How much time do we have before he does something about it?" Nathaniel looked at the papers spread across the table, at 11 years of her father's work, at Gerald's notes, at the shape of a crime that was almost fully visible now. "Not much," he said. "We need to move faster." Clara pulled the next stack of papers toward her and untied the ribbon. "Then let's move faster," she said. They moved faster. Clara worked through the 1813 and 1814 records, while Nathaniel cross-referenced against Gerald's pulled files from the estate archive. Gerald himself sat at the far end of the table, copying out clean summaries in his precise attorney's hand, dates, amounts, forged signatures, fraudulent allocations, building the kind of organized legal record that a federal court would need to see. Nobody spoke much. They didn't need to. The papers spoke. By 4 o'clock, they had confirmed 11 of the 12 missing widow payments. By 4:30, they had traced 3 of the 4 fraudulent land transfers to a single Richmond property account, registered under the name Everett & Sons Trading Company, a company that, as far as anyone in the county knew, did not exist. "He built himself a second life," Clara said quietly, looking at the Richmond account entries. "Right here, while managing yours." "With our money," Nathaniel said. "With your money and your name and the trust your father gave him." She set down the paper she was holding. "He was patient. That's what I keep coming back to. He didn't rush it. He let it build slowly, year by year, small enough that nobody would look twice." "My brother looked," Nathaniel said. The words dropped into the room like a stone. Gerald stopped writing. "Your brother looked," Clara said carefully. "And 3 weeks later he was sick. My father looked. And 3 weeks later he was sick." She looked at Nathaniel directly. "Dr. Marsh has been on this estate since your grandfather's time." "I know." "Recommended by Everett." "I know that too." "Then you understand what I'm saying." Nathaniel's voice was very controlled. "I understand exactly what you're saying, and I can't prove it yet, which means I can't act on it yet, which means—" He stopped, pressed one hand flat on the table. "Which means we keep working." They kept working. At 5 o'clock, Gerald looked up from his papers. "There's something else," he said. "I found it in the December 1814 archive, the duplicate your father kept." He slid a document across the table toward Nathaniel. "This is a land deed transfer. 40 acres in the eastern parcel. The Greer family land your brother was investigating." Nathaniel picked it up. "The transfer records here say the Greers defaulted on their final payment and the land reverted to the estate," Gerald said. "But look at the date of the recorded default. November 14th, 1814. And—" Gerald slid a second paper across. "This is William Bennett's copy of the Greer payment receipt, signed by Bennett, countersigned by the receiving clerk, dated November 3rd, 1814. Clara leaned over. 11 days before the supposed default. "They paid it," Nathaniel said. "They paid the full amount 11 days before the date Everett recorded them as defaulting." "Yes," Gerald said, "which means the land transfer to the estate was fraudulent. The Greers paid. Everett recorded a false default, took the land, and based on the Richmond account records sold the parcel 18 months later to a private buyer for considerably more than the original deed value." Nathaniel set both papers down very carefully. The Greer family. He tried to remember them. He'd been 20-something in 1814, managing the Philadelphia end of the family's merchant business. The Greers had been tenants on the eastern parcel since before he was born. Solid people. Hard-working. He remembered seeing them at church as a child, a man with big rough hands and a wife who always brought something to the harvest supper. "Do you know where they are now?" he asked Gerald. Gerald's expression was answer enough. "I can find out." "Do that." Nathaniel stood up. "But not tonight. Tonight I need you to secure everything we've collected. Everything somewhere in this house that Everett cannot access. Is there a room with a lock he doesn't have a key to?" "Your father's personal study on the 3rd floor," Gerald said. "The key has been in the library safe since your father died. Everett has never had access." "Good. Take it all up there tonight. Lock it. And Gerald?" Nathaniel looked at him. "Sleep lightly." Gerald did not look like a man who intended to sleep at all. "Of course, sir." Nathaniel turned to Clara. "I'm going to walk you home." She started to object. He shook his head once. "It's nearly dark," he said. "And you've been in this house all day working on documents that could put a man in federal prison. I'm walking you home." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she packed the tin box, tucked it under her arm, and said, "All right." They left through the side door. Not the formal entrance, not the delivery entrance, but the plain door off the kitchen that the family used when they didn't want ceremony. Nathaniel had walked out that door 10,000 times as a boy. The summer evening was warm and full of cricket sound. They walked the lane in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The tin box was tucked under Clara's arm, and she held it with the steadiness of someone carrying something that had waited a long time to be useful. "I want you to keep those papers," Nathaniel said. "Don't bring them back to the house until Crane arrives from Richmond. I don't trust the estate right now, not the building, not the staff. Everett has had too many years to make himself indispensable to people." "I'll keep them," Clara said. "There's a loose board in my mother's bedroom that Everett doesn't know about." "Has he ever been to your house?" She was quiet for a moment. "Once, after my father died, when he came to tell my mother about the debt." Nathaniel said nothing. "He was very kind about it," Clara said. Her voice was flat. "That was the worst part. He sat at our table, and he drank our tea, and he explained very gently that my father had unfortunately made some errors in his final months, and that the resulting debt would require, and he actually used the word require, as if it were a natural force, the transfer of our home." She paused. "My mother cried, and he patted her hand." "Clara." She looked sideways at him. He almost never used her first name. They'd been doing this all day, sliding without quite acknowledging it into something less formal, like two people who met in a crisis, and simply didn't have time to observe the usual distances. "I'm going to make this right," he said. "I know that doesn't undo it. I know I can't give you back your father or your mother's house or your brother's 4 years. But I am going to make it right." She was quiet for a long moment. "You don't owe me that." "No," he said. "I owe your father that, and my brother, and 12 widows who never got their $20 a year." He looked at her. "And I owe it to myself. I've been the man at the top of this house for 4 years, and I didn't look. I have to answer for that." She stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him in the evening light with that careful measuring expression, the accountant's gaze, the look that tallied and weighed and refused to be charmed, and then something in it shifted, not softened, clarified, like a window being wiped clean. "All right, Nathaniel," she said, quietly. Just his name with the same plain weight she put on everything. "Then let's make it right." He walked her to her mother's door. He did not go in. He tipped his hat, a small genuine gesture, and walked back down the lane in the dark. He was halfway home when he heard hooves behind him. Fast. He stepped off the lane, and the horse went past one of the estate horses. He could tell by the marking on the flank, even in the dark, ridden hard in the direction of the Richmond road. He turned and watched it go. The rider had been in the estate livery, which meant the rider was one of Everett's people. Nathaniel stood in the dark for a moment, feeling the pieces move. Everett was sending word to someone. Richmond, most likely. The anonymous property account. The network that had been running beneath the Whitmore estate like a second set of roots for 12 years. He needed Crane faster than tomorrow. He went back to the house at a run. Gerald was still in the library when Nathaniel came through the door and told him what he'd seen. Gerald's face did the thing it had been doing all day, moving between the expression of a man who hoped he was wrong and the expression of a man who knew he wasn't. "He's warning someone," Gerald said. "Yes. Which means by tomorrow he'll have had time to prepare a response. Cover stories, explanations, whoever he's been running the Richmond account with." Nathaniel looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 8 in the evening. "How far is it to Richmond?" "A hard day's ride. Your man left at dawn and—" Gerald checked himself. "You sent the rider this afternoon, not this morning. He won't reach Richmond until late tomorrow. Everett's rider left tonight. He'll reach his contact by morning." Nathaniel ran one hand through his hair. "We need a way to slow Everett down without alerting him that we know what he's doing." Gerald took off his spectacles again. He turned them over in his hands. "I may have a thought," he said slowly. "Mrs. Alderton." Nathaniel stared at him. "I'm sorry. Mrs. Alderton was here this morning. She was present when Miss Bennet answered your question. She left in a state of—" Gerald chose his word carefully. "Considerable agitation. But she is also the woman whose husband served on the County Land Commission for 15 years. I know who her husband was. Then you may recall that Edgar Alderton was one of the commissioners who reviewed the Whitmore Eastern parcel transfers in 1815. He signed off on 3 of them. Gerald set his spectacles back on his nose. If those transfers were fraudulent, his signature is on them. He may not have known, but his signature is there. Nathaniel understood what Gerald was suggesting. You think Everett has something on the Aldertons? I think Edgar Alderton signed 3 fraudulent land transfers and died 2 years later without ever raising a question about them. I think Mrs. Alderton has been uncomfortable in Everett's presence for as long as I can remember, in the particular way of someone who suspects something but is afraid to look closely. Gerald paused. I think if someone were to speak with her privately and honestly about what we've found, she might be willing to assist in slowing Mr. Everett's movements. She has standing in this county that even Everett has to respect. Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. You are more devious than I gave you credit for, Gerald. I prefer the word strategic, sir. Can you reach her tonight? Her estate is 40 minutes by horse. I can be there and back before midnight. Go, Nathaniel said. Tell her everything. Tell her her husband may have been used, not complicit. Tell her we need her to host something tomorrow. A dinner, a gathering. Something that requires Everett's attendance and keeps him in company from mid-morning until we have Crane on the road. Gerald was already reaching for his coat. And Gerald, Nathaniel added, take the long way around, not the Richmond road. Gerald nodded once and was gone. The house settled into the particular quiet of late evening fires. Banked staff retired to their quarters, the big rooms going dark one by one. Nathaniel sat alone in his father's library with a lamp and the copy of his brother's letter and the preliminary summary Gerald had made of the day's findings. He read through the summary twice. 12 years. 4 fraudulent transfers. 7 forged signatures. 2 accounts emptied. 1 phantom company in Richmond. 11 missing widow payments. 1 accountant dead mid-investigation. 1 estate heir dead mid-sentence. 1 family turned out of their house on a forged debt. He sat with it all and let himself feel the full weight of it. Not the legal weight, not the financial weight, but the human weight. The weight of the Greer family losing land they'd paid for. The weight of 12 women going without $20 a year that his grandfather had set aside specifically so they wouldn't have to. The weight of Clara's 14-year-old brother working in a mill because William Bennett had tried to do the right thing. He sat with all of that until he'd felt enough of it to be sure he would not forget it when this was over. Then he went to bed and slept 5 hours, which was 4 more than he expected. He was at the table at first light when Gerald returned, looking tired but purposeful in the particular way of a man who had accomplished something. She'll do it, Gerald said, dropping into a chair and accepting the cup of coffee Nathaniel pushed toward him. She was not surprised, Nathaniel. I want you to understand that. When I told her what we'd found, her first response was to close her eyes for about 30 seconds. When she opened them, she said, I always thought Edgar was too easy with those transfers. She has been carrying something about it for years. Does she know how much her husband was involved? I told her what the evidence shows, that his signature is on the fraudulent transfers, but that there's nothing in the record to indicate he knew they were fraudulent. He may have been deceived. She seemed... Gerald thought about it. She seemed to take some comfort in that. Not enough, but some. She'll hold the dinner. A luncheon, 11 o'clock. She's sending the formal invitation to Everett this morning, first post. She'll keep him occupied until at least 3 in the afternoon. She's very good at that. Yes, Nathaniel agreed. She is. She asked me to tell you one thing. Gerald wrapped both hands around his cup. She said, and I quote, tell Nathaniel Whitmore that if he manages to clean up this mess without destroying Edgar's name entirely, I will personally tell every woman in this county that the Bennett girl was right about the hungry child. And I have a loud voice. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Edgar Alderton's name won't be destroyed, he said. Not if I have anything to say about it. I thought you might say that. Everett appeared at breakfast at his usual time, in his usual good humor, wearing his usual coat. He had the manner of a man who had spent the evening doing nothing unusual and was entirely comfortable with the world. He mentioned the weather. He mentioned the state of the western field fences. He mentioned that he ought to ride out to check the mill contract this week. Nathaniel watched him across the breakfast table and thought, "You are very good at this. You have been doing it for 30 years. You are good enough that you almost don't need to work at it anymore." Almost. Because this morning, eating his breakfast with his easy smile, Charles Everett was also watching. Not Nathaniel, he was too practiced to stare, but the room, the doors, the way Gerald moved, the particular quality of the morning. He was taking the temperature of things. "Charles," Nathaniel said, "I believe Mrs. Alderton is sending you a luncheon invitation this morning." Everett looked at him. "Is she?" "I mentioned last week that she'd like your thoughts on the land drainage proposal for the Southern County parcels. She's putting together a small gathering." Nathaniel took a sip of his coffee. "I know you've been meaning to speak with her about it." Something moved briefly through Everett's expression. Just briefly. The calculation. The internal checking of exits. Then, "Of course, happy to. She keeps an excellent table." "She does," Nathaniel agreed. When Everett left the breakfast room, Nathaniel exhaled slowly. The morning passed. Josiah Crane arrived at 2:15. He was not what Nathaniel had expected. He was 63 years old, short and square, with white hair cut close, and the deeply unimpressed expression of a man who had spent 40 years watching powerful people behave badly and had long since stopped being surprised by it. He wore traveling clothes, and he carried a leather case, and he shook Nathaniel's hand with the grip of someone who didn't put on a performance for wealth. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "your rider found me on the road. I was already heading this way." "Already heading this way?" Crane set his case on the table. "I got a letter 3 weeks ago from a woman named Clara Bennett, seamstress, Whitmore County. She wrote a precise, well-organized description of a scheme involving fraudulent land transfers and misappropriated relief funds on the Whitmore estate going back approximately 12 years and asked if I handled cases involving federal land fraud." He looked at Nathaniel steadily. "I handle cases involving federal land fraud." Nathaniel stared at him. "She wrote to you 3 weeks ago," he said. "She did. Said she had her father's papers but needed someone with federal standing to review them. Said she'd been waiting 4 years for the right moment." Crane paused. "She also said she was going to create that moment herself if it didn't show up soon." A pause. "I believe she may have moved faster than she expected." Nathaniel thought about a seamstress in a faded blue dress walking through the wrong door of Whitmore Hall with a bundle of mended shirts and mud on her boots. She'd already set this in motion. She hadn't been waiting for rescue. She'd been waiting for a witness. "Where is she?" Crane asked. "She should be here within the hour," Nathaniel said. "I sent word this morning." "Good." Crane opened his case. "Then let's use the time." They went through the documents. Gerald laid everything out in the order he'd organized it: chronological, then by category, then by the nature of the fraud. Crane moved through it with the focused speed of a man reading something he already half understood, asking sharp, brief questions, making marks in his own ledger. At one point, he looked up and said, "The forged signatures, do you have a document signed legitimately by the same man at a similar time for comparison?" "7?" Gerald said, and produced them. Crane looked at them side by side. The forger was careful, but not meticulous. There's a hesitation in the capital W that doesn't appear in the authentic signatures. He set them down. This will hold. Clara arrived at 3 o'clock. She came in the same way she always did, without ceremony, without announcement, with the tin box under her arm. She stopped when she saw Crane. Crane looked at her. "Miss Bennett? Mr. Crane?" She set the box on the table. "You came." "I was already coming," he said. "Your letter was thorough. I only wish you'd sent it 4 years ago." Something moved across Clara's face that Nathaniel hadn't seen before. Not quite grief. The particular expression of someone who has been walking uphill for a very long time and has just been told they're almost at the top. "I didn't have anyone to send it to 4 years ago," she said. "I needed someone inside the house first." She looked at Nathaniel when she said it. He held her gaze. He wanted to say something. He couldn't find the right words, which was not a familiar sensation. Crane, with the tact of a man who had learned to read rooms, said briskly, "Let's get to work. We have at most a few hours before Everett returns from his luncheon and begins whatever countermeasures he's planning." Clara sat down and opened the tin box. They had 2 hours and 40 minutes. In that time, Crane reviewed and authenticated 34 documents. He identified 11 as meeting the federal threshold for fraud prosecution. He drafted a preliminary complaint citing the forged signatures as the core federal violation. Forgery of a deceased person's signature on a financial instrument was federal territory, Crane explained, which meant the case would go to a federal court and not a local one. A local court in Whitmore County would have been vulnerable to Everett's network. A federal court would not. At 5:40, Gerald appeared in the doorway. "Everett is back," he said. "His horse just came up the lane. Gerald paused. "He's not alone. He brought someone with him, a man I don't recognize, young, riding his own horse." Nathaniel stood up. Description: tall, red hair, carrying a document case. Crane looked up from his work. "That description matches a man named Philip Sorrell. He's Everett's attorney in Richmond. Handles the property accounts." He looked at Nathaniel. "If Sorrell is here, Everett isn't just responding. He's preparing an offense." "What kind of offense?" Clara asked. "The kind where he gets ahead of the story," Crane said. "He'll claim your father's papers were fabricated. He'll claim the discrepancies were your father's errors, not his crimes. He'll paint Bennett as a disgruntled employee who kept false records to frame a man he had a grudge against." He paused. "And then he'll claim you, Miss Bennett, have been manipulating Mr. Whitmore with a false narrative in order to extract benefit from the situation." Clara's jaw tightened. "He'll say I seduced Nathaniel into this." "He'll strongly imply it, yes." "He won't be the first," she said flatly. "Mrs. Alderton got there before him." "It won't stick," Nathaniel said. His voice was harder than he'd meant it to be. "Not with the federal documents, not with the forged signatures, not with—" "It doesn't have to stick," Crane said, cutting him off with the gentle directness of a man who had seen a lot of courtrooms. "It only has to cloud things long enough for him to move the Richmond assets. If he can get the funds out of the Everett and Sons account before we freeze it, the financial evidence is significantly harder to pursue." He started stacking his papers rapidly. "We need to file before morning, tonight if possible." "You can do that. I brought a notarized federal court authority with me from Richmond. I can file a preliminary complaint with the federal land court from here and have a freeze on the Richmond account by morning if we finish the documentation in the next 2 hours. He looked around the table. "I need everyone's best effort. No interruptions." Nathaniel went to the door and called for Gerald. "Close the main house," he said quietly. "Tell the staff the house is closed for the evening family business. Anyone who asks where I am, I'm not available. And Gerald." He lowered his voice further. "When Everett tries to come to the library, tell him I'm reviewing accounts with my attorney and I'll speak with him at breakfast. And if he insists—" "He won't insist," Nathaniel said. "He'll want to know what we know before he moves. He'll push, but he won't force it. He's been careful for 30 years. He won't stop being careful now." He paused. "Just make sure Sorrell doesn't get near this room." "Understood." They worked. The lamp burned low and was replaced. Clara's handwriting appeared alongside Crane's notations on the authentication copies. Her cross-referencing of her father's marginal notes against the estate originals was something no one else in that room could do. And she did it without being asked, moving through the stacks with her father's particular efficiency, calling out page numbers and dates. At one point, Crane looked at her over his spectacles and said, "Your father trained you in accountancy." "He trained me in honesty," she said without looking up. "The accounting came with it." Crane made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was close. At 9:30, Nathaniel heard footsteps in the hall. Then Gerald's voice, apologetic but firm. Then Everett's voice, smooth, reasonable, and very slightly elevated in pitch from its usual register. Clara heard it too. She looked at the door. He's asking about Crane, she said quietly. He knows who he is. Yes, Nathaniel said. How? Sorrel. Crane has a reputation in Richmond. Nathaniel kept his pen moving. It means Everett knows what we're doing. It means the timeline just got shorter. How much shorter? He won't wait for breakfast. Nathaniel looked at Crane. How much more do you need? 40 minutes, Crane said. Maybe less. In the hallway, Everett's voice had not risen further. It had done something more controlled and more dangerous. It had gotten quieter. The particular quiet of a man choosing his next move very carefully. Then footsteps moved away. Gerald appeared in the doorway looking like a man who had just stood in front of an oncoming horse and been surprised to find it slowing down. He's gone to his rooms, Gerald said. He said... Gerald paused. He said to tell you he looks forward to clearing things up in the morning. He won't wait until morning, Clara said. No, Nathaniel agreed. He won't. He looked at Crane. Crane was already writing faster. Clara turned back to the papers. Her hand was steady. Her face was steady. Everything about her was the steadiness of someone who has been preparing for this for 4 years and is not going to come apart in the last 40 minutes. Nathaniel watched her for 1 second. Just one. Then he picked up his pen. 38 minutes later, Crane set down his pen. Done, he said. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Clara. He looked at the stack of authenticated, organized, legally documented evidence that represented 12 years of one man's crimes and 4 years of one family's patience. This will hold, he said simply. This will more than hold. Clara let out a breath. Just one breath. Slow and quiet. The kind that carries something that's been compressed for a long time. Nathaniel looked at her across the table, across the lamp, across the tin box, and the papers, and the 4 years and everything that had come before this moment. She looked back at him. Your father kept his records, Nathaniel said. He did, she said. He was right to. Clara looked at the tin box. At the neat stacks, the careful handwriting. The 11 years of honesty that had waited in a tin box under a floorboard because no one with the power to use it had been willing to look. He was right about most things, she said. He was just wrong about who'd listen. In the hall, somewhere on the floor above, a door opened. They all heard it. Crane capped his ink. I'd suggest we don't spend the night discussing it. He was right. The night was not finished with them yet. The door upstairs opened and then closed. Footsteps. Measured. Not rushing. The footsteps of a man who had decided something and was moving toward it with the particular calm of someone who had spent 30 years making problems disappear before they became problems. Nathaniel was already on his feet. Crane, he said, the completed documents. Now. Crane had them bundled and tied in under 30 seconds. He passed them to Nathaniel, who crossed to the library, safe his grandfather's safe, the one Everett had never had the combination to, and locked them inside. Clara stood at the table. She had put her father's tin box into the cloth bag and was holding it by the strap with both hands, standing very still, her eyes on the door. Gerald appeared in the doorway before Everett did. His face was the face of a man who had tried to do his job and been walked past. I'm sorry, Gerald said. He said it was urgent. Then Everett was in the doorway behind him. He looked at the room. He looked at the cleared table, the lamp Crane standing to one side. Clara with her bag, Nathaniel in front of the closed safe. He took all of it in with one long practiced look, and his face showed nothing except the warm, slightly concerned expression of a man who had been kept out of an important conversation and had come to offer his help. Nathaniel, he said, I apologize for the hour, but I heard Mr. Crane had arrived and I thought given the nature of his work it might be useful for me to be available, in case there were questions about the estate accounts. There were, Nathaniel said. We've answered them. A pause, just a beat. So small that if you weren't watching for it, you'd miss it. Good, Everett said warmly. Then perhaps tomorrow morning I can sit down with you and Mr. Crane together and... Charles, Nathaniel said, sit down. Something moved through Everett's expression. Not fear, not yet. The recalibration of a man who has just heard a tone of voice from someone he manages that he has never heard before. He sat. Nathaniel did not sit. He stood with his back to the safe and looked at the man who had run his family's estate for 30 years, who had sat at their table and attended their funerals and been trusted with everything, and he felt something that he had not expected to feel in this moment. Not rage. Not the hot, righteous anger he'd been building toward all day. Something colder, more precise. Grief. Charles, he said. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to think very carefully before you answer it, because the answer you give me in the next 30 seconds is going to determine a great deal about how the next few months of your life go. Everett's hands rested on his knees, perfectly still. Of course. The Everett and Sons Trading Company, the Richmond property account. How long has it been running? The silence that followed was 7 seconds long. Nathaniel counted. In those 7 seconds, Charles Everett's face went through something remarkable. Not collapse, the man was too controlled for collapse. But a sequence. A rapid, nearly invisible sequence that Nathaniel recognized, having seen it once before on the face of a business partner in Philadelphia, who had been caught with his hand in a ledger he shouldn't have been in. The sequence was calculation assessment decision. Everett had calculated the room. He had assessed how much they knew, and he had made a decision. I don't know what you're referring to, he said pleasantly. There may be some confusion about the Richmond accounts. They're complex, and without the proper context. Philip Sorrell, Crane said. Everett turned to look at him. Philip Sorrell has been managing the Everett and Sons account out of his Richmond office for 9 years, Crane said. He said it conversationally, the way a man mentions weather. He handles 4 accounts of this type for different clients. The operational pattern is similar in each. Small extractions, false debt records, fraudulent land transfer documentation. He paused. Sorrell is known to me professionally, Mr. Everett. He has been for some time. Everett looked at Crane. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Clara standing quietly with her bag. Then he looked at the cloth bag specifically. Those are Bennett's papers, he said, not a question. Clara's hands tightened on the strap. She didn't move. William Bennett was a troubled man in his final year, Everett said, and his voice had shifted. It had dropped the warmth without becoming cold, had moved into something more careful, more legal. His records were unreliable. He had a habit of misinterpreting what he saw. I tried to work with him. I was patient with him. But in the end, the errors were significant, and I had no choice but to— He kept copies, Clara said. Everett looked at her. Everything he submitted to you, she said. Every ledger entry, every allocation record, every payment receipt. He kept copies, cross-referenced, annotated. She held the bag. 11 years of them. Miss Bennett, Everett said, and now his voice had something in it that it hadn't had before, something that was not quite a threat, but was wearing that shape. I understand you have a great deal of feeling about your father. That's natural. Grief can lead people to construct narratives that— Charles. Nathaniel's voice was very quiet. Stop. Everett stopped. I have a forged signature, Nathaniel said. My father's signature on the widow's fund transfer document from March of 1809. My father was in Philadelphia in March of 1809. Gerald was with him. The signature is false. We have comparison documents. He paused. That is federal fraud, not an accounting dispute, not a narrative. Federal fraud. And Mr. Crane has filed a preliminary complaint with the federal land court tonight, which means by morning there will be a freeze on the Richmond account and a federal inquiry into every transaction bearing the Whitmore name that touched that account. Everett said nothing. For the first time since he'd walked into the room, he said absolutely nothing. Nathaniel watched his face and saw the moment, the precise, identifiable moment, when Charles Everett understood that this was not a room he could manage his way out of. I want you to leave this house tonight, Nathaniel said. Not tomorrow morning, tonight. You'll go to your rooms, you'll take what is personally yours, and you'll go. You won't touch the estate office. You won't touch the archive. You won't contact Sorrell. He paused. and you will present yourself to the federal land court in Richmond within 10 days, as Mr. Crane's complaint will require." Everett's jaw moved. "Nathaniel, I have served this family for 30 years, Nathaniel said. "I know. I've been counting what those 30 years cost us." He looked at the man steadily. "Leave tonight, Charles, while you still can do it with some dignity." Everett stood. He looked around the room one more time at Crane, at Gerald, at Clara, at Nathaniel, at the closed safe, at the lamp burning low, at the table where 34 documents had just been authenticated against him. He straightened his coat. "This is a mistake," he said quietly. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Yours, made 12 years ago. I'm only the one who finally looked." Everett left the room. They heard his footsteps in the hall, measured as they had been on the way in, then up the stairs. Nobody spoke until the sound of them faded. Clara set the cloth bag down on the table. Her hands were shaking slightly, just slightly, the small, involuntary tremor of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. Nathaniel saw it. He didn't comment. He pulled out her chair, and she sat. "Is it enough?" she asked Crane. "What we have, is it enough to hold him?" "The forgery alone is enough for federal charges," Crane said. "The property records, the false debt documentation, the widow's fund transfer, those add weight. The Greer land deed adds weight. The Bennett papers." He looked at the cloth bag. "The Bennett papers are what make this unambiguous. Your father documented the pattern over years in real time with annotations. That is not retroactive reconstruction. That is a contemporaneous record." He paused. "It's the strongest kind of evidence there is." "Will he try to run?" Gerald asked. "Sorrel will advise him not to," Crane said. "Running makes it worse, and Sorrel knows that. He'll advise compliance and a prepared defense." He gathered his coat. "I'll leave for Richmond at first light. I want to be there before the freeze takes effect, so I can ensure the timing is airtight." He looked at Nathaniel. "I'll need the authenticated documents. They're in the safe. I'll have them ready before dawn." Crane looked at Clara. "Miss Bennett, your father's papers should stay in your possession for now. Do not allow them out of your hands until I formally request them for the court proceeding." "I won't," she said. "Good." He shook her hand, then Nathaniel's, then Gerald's. "Get some sleep, all of you. Tomorrow will be long." He left them. The library was very quiet. Gerald began tidying his papers with the slow, careful movements of a man who was exhausted in every layer of himself. He stacked. He organized. He did not speak. Clara looked at the lamp. Nathaniel looked at her. "You wrote to Crane 3 weeks ago," he said. She looked up. "Yes. Before you came to the house. Before I asked you the question. Before all of that." She was quiet for a moment. "I'd been watching the house for months, waiting for a moment when there was someone inside who was looking for the truth instead of away from it." She held his gaze. "When I heard about the 30 women, I thought maybe. A man asking that kind of question is either very serious about finding something real or performing. I walked through that door to find out which. And—" a small pause. "And you said, let her stay." Nathaniel was quiet. "The question about the child," he said. "The hungry child and the bread. I'd been asking it all morning and getting beautiful, useless answers. When you answered it, you—" He stopped. "You didn't answer like someone who'd rehearsed. You answered like someone who knew what hunger looked like." "I do know what hunger looks like," she said simply. "Since I was 22. He looked at her across the lamp, across everything between them, the tin box, the papers, the 4 years, the distance between who they were supposed to be in a room together and who they actually were. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "I'm going to need help rebuilding this estate," he said. "Not the accounts I can hire accountants, the other kind of rebuilding. The kind where you go back and find every family that was wronged, and you make it right one by one, and you change the way the house actually works instead of just changing who runs it." He paused. I don't know how to do that alone. She considered him with that clear measuring look. You're asking me to help you. I am. I'm a seamstress. You're your father's daughter, he said. You understand accounts, evidence people, and what honesty is supposed to look like in practice. That's what I need. It's more useful than watercolors. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile. You've been thinking about the watercolors all day. Since 9 this morning, he admitted. She looked at the tin box, at the lamp, at the safe where 34 authenticated documents were locked, at the summer dark pressing against the window. I'm not coming back to this house as a seamstress, she said. No, he agreed. That's not what I'm offering. She looked at him directly. Then tell me what you're offering, Nathaniel, plainly, because I've spent 4 years in rooms where powerful men said one thing and meant another, and I do not have the patience for it anymore. He held her gaze, an equal hand in what comes next. Your name on the decisions, your voice in every room I walk into. He paused. And an honest answer to whatever you ask me for as long as you're willing to ask. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's a significant offer, she said, from a man I met 24 hours ago. I've met 30 women in the last week, he said. I reckon I know what I'm looking at. The almost smile became a real one. Small and quiet, and completely her own. Not a drawing room smile, not a performance. The real thing, which was considerably rarer and considerably better. Ask me again, she said, when the court proceedings are finished and Charles Everett is answering for what he did, and the Greer family has their land back, and the widows have received what they were owed. Ask me then, when you know what the rebuilding actually costs and you still want to do it. She stood, picking up her bag. If you still want to ask, then I'll have an answer ready. Fair enough, he said. She moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused, and the pause had the quality of something she'd been deciding for several seconds. Nathaniel. Yes. My father used to say that a house is only as honest as the people who run it. She looked back at him. Start being honest. The rest will follow. She left. He stood in the quiet library for a moment, and then he got to work. The next 10 days moved like a river after a storm, fast, relentless, carrying things that had been fixed in one place for years and depositing them somewhere entirely different. Crane filed the formal federal complaint on the morning after he left Whitmore Hall. By noon of that day, the Everett and Sons Richmond account was frozen. By evening, Philip Sorrell had hired additional counsel and issued a statement through his office, denying all connection to fraudulent activity. It was a statement that lasted approximately 36 hours before the federal examiner arrived in Richmond with Crane's documentation. Gerald received word at the estate on the third day Sorrell had reversed course. He was cooperating with the federal inquiry. He was providing records. He was in the particular language of men who have realized that the ship is going down and have decided to swim for the nearest shore, fully willing to discuss the nature of his business relationship with Charles Everett. Charles Everett, who had left Whitmore Hall on the night of the confrontation and ridden to Richmond, was questioned by federal examiners on the fourth day. He presented himself as Crane had predicted, with counsel and composure and a prepared explanation. The explanation addressed the accounting discrepancies as errors. It addressed the Richmond account as a legitimate private investment. It did not adequately address the forged signature on the widow's fund transfer because there was no adequate address for a forged signature on a document from a month when the signatory was 2 weeks right away. On the sixth day, a federal warrant was issued. Nathaniel received word by Ryder at the estate. He read the notice once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the library safe alongside the authenticated documents. Then he went to find Gerald. I need to locate the Greer family, he said. Whatever it takes. Gerald had already been looking. They're in Charlottesville, he said. Samuel Greer, the son of the original deed holder, he's working at a cooperage. His mother is alive. She's 71. Can you reach them? I already wrote, Gerald said quietly. 3 days ago. I hope that was not overstepping. It wasn't, Nathaniel said. What did you tell them? That there had been a significant error in the estate records regarding their family's land, that Mr. Whitmore was aware of it and intended to make it right, that they would be hearing from him directly. Gerald paused. I didn't tell them the full extent. I thought that should come from you. It will, Nathaniel said. Set up the meeting. He went to see Clara that same afternoon. She was at her mother's house, which was a small rented room in the county seat above a dry goods store. Her mother, a thin woman with sharp eyes, and the kind of careful dignity that comes from having had everything else stripped away, opened the door and looked at Nathaniel Whitmore on her step, with the expression of a woman who had learned not to expect much from men of his name. Mrs. Bennet, Nathaniel said. My name is Nathaniel Whitmore. I owe you an apology that I should have given 4 years ago, and a conversation that I've come to have in person if you'll allow it. Mrs. Bennet looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped back. Clara appeared behind her mother. She was holding a cup of tea and she looked at Nathaniel over the rim of it with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite the absence of it. Come in, she said. He came in. He sat at the small table in the small room and he told Ellen Bennet what had happened to her husband, what had been done to her family, and what he intended to do about it. He did not soften it. He did not arrange it to make himself look better. He told her plainly in order, and he let her respond as she needed to. She cried. Not immediately. She listened first with the same contained attention Clara had, and then, when he finished, she sat quietly for about 20 seconds. And then she cried. Not loudly. The quiet crying of someone who has been right about something terrible for 4 years and has just been told, finally, that they were right. Clara put her hand over her mother's and said nothing. Nathaniel waited. When Ellen Bennet looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. William knew, she said. He knew something was wrong. He wasn't confused. He wasn't making errors. He knew. He knew, Nathaniel said. And he documented it. And because of those documents, Charles Everett is facing a federal warrant. Ellen was quiet for a moment. Is that enough? For what he did to my husband? The question was simple and devastating, and it sat in the room between them with the weight of everything it contained. I don't know, Nathaniel said, because he didn't know, because some things couldn't be made right in the way that made the full measure of the wrong disappear. He knew that. The law will answer for the fraud. The property lost, the money, I will make that right. But William Bennet... He paused. I can't give him back to you. And I won't pretend that anything I do amounts to the same thing. Ellen looked at him. Whatever she saw in his face, whatever it was that she measured in the silence, she gave a small definitive nod. Clara told me you were different, she said. She said she thought you were actually looking. I was slow to look, he said. But you looked, Ellen said. That's more than most. He left an hour later. Clara walked him out to the street. Your mother? He said. She's stronger than she looks, Clara said. She's been waiting for that conversation for 4 years. I think it helped. Did it help you? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. It's not finished yet, she said. It won't help the way it should until the people who were wronged actually get what they're owed. She looked at him. The widows, the Greers, the families on those 4 fraudulent transfers. Until those things are actually done, not promised actually done, I won't feel what I'm supposed to feel yet. I know, he said. I'm working on it. I know you are. She looked at him for a moment. The Greer meeting. Can I be there? I was going to ask you to be. On the 8th day, Samuel Greer arrived at Whitmore Hall. He was 41 years old, his father's son in the shape of his hands and the set of his jaw, and the way he moved through the door of the house that had wronged his family, like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head many times and was determined to get through it without showing how much it cost him. His mother had not come. She had said she was too old for long roads. Nathaniel suspected she was too old for the particular kind of hope that comes with reclamation. The hope that if it doesn't hold, breaks something that can't be repaired a second time. Clara was there. Nathaniel had positioned this correctly. He had put her at the table not as a guest, but as a presence withstanding. Crane was there. Gerald was there. Samuel Greer sat down across from them all and looked at Nathaniel. "You said there was an error," he said, "in your letter." "I said that because I didn't want to put the full truth in a letter," Nathaniel said. "What I'm going to tell you now is the full truth, and I'm going to tell it plainly." He told it plainly. Samuel Greer listened the way his family apparently listened, with complete stillness, eyes on the person speaking, hands flat on the table. When Nathaniel finished, Samuel looked at the deed documents Crane placed in front of him. The false default record, the Bennett receipt showing the full payment made 11 days prior, the forged authorization on the land transfer. He looked at them for a long time. "My father paid that land off," Samuel said finally. "He died 3 years after we lost it. He died believing he'd failed to protect us." His voice was controlled, just barely. "He told my mother that on his deathbed, that he'd failed." Nobody spoke. "He didn't fail," Nathaniel said. "He was defrauded by a man who used my family's name to do it. I know it doesn't fix what your father carried, but I want you to have it on record from me, in front of witnesses, that your father was an honest man who paid what he owed and was robbed anyway." Samuel Greer looked at the table. He pressed both hands flat against it very hard for about 5 seconds. Then he looked up. "The land," he said. "Can it come back?" "The parcel was sold," Crane said. "The current owner purchased it in good faith from a buyer who purchased it from Everett's company. Unwinding that title is complex." He paused. "However, the sale proceeds flowed through the fraudulent account. Those funds are currently frozen as part of the federal inquiry. Mr. Whitmore has agreed that the value of the original parcel, plus the market appreciation over 12 years, will be paid to your family from the Whitmore estate directly, ahead of the federal resolution, without waiting for the court to order it." Samuel looked at Nathaniel. "Why ahead?" "Because you've waited long enough," Nathaniel said. "And because the money is mine to give, and I'm giving it. The federal process will take months. Your mother is 71. He held Samuel's gaze. "I don't want her to wait." Something moved across Samuel Greer's face that he clearly had not expected to have to manage in this room. He looked at Clara. He didn't know who she was exactly, but something in her presence, the way she sat, the stillness of her seemed to register as someone he could look at without having to perform composure for. "Who are you?" he asked her. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said. "My father was the accountant who kept the receipt that proves your family's payment. He tried to bring it forward and was prevented." She paused. "His papers are the reason Mr. Everett is facing federal charges." Samuel looked at her for a moment. "Your father," he said. "Is he? He died 4 years ago?" she said. Samuel was quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. Simply. "Thank you," Clara said. Simply. They looked at each other across the table. Two people whose fathers had been ground up by the same machine meeting on the other side of it. "The other families," Samuel said, looking back at Nathaniel. "The ones on the other 3 transfers. Do they know?" "Gerald is locating them now," Nathaniel said. "They'll be contacted this week. And the widows? The assistance fund." "The records identify 11 women we can trace," Crane said. 3 are deceased. The remaining 8 will receive the full amount owed plus 12 years of accumulated interest. Mr. Whitmore has already executed that authorization. Samuel Greer sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at the table, then at Nathaniel. "My grandfather worked this land," he said. "Before your grandfather owned it, he was a tenant farmer. He saved for 22 years to buy that parcel. 22 years. He was quiet for a moment. "And a man sat in this house and stole it with a piece of paper." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "And your family you didn't know." "We didn't look," Nathaniel said. "There's a difference, and it matters. but not enough to excuse it. Samuel regarded him. "No," he said slowly. "Not enough to excuse it." He paused. "But enough to make this conversation worth having." He stood. He extended his hand across the table to Nathaniel. Nathaniel took it. It was not a comfortable handshake. It was not the handshake of two men who have come to comfortable terms. It was the handshake of two men who have looked at something difficult together and have agreed with all the unresolved weight of it still present to move forward from where they are. That was enough. That was, in fact, considerable. After Samuel Greer left the room was quiet for a long moment. Clara was looking at the empty chair where he'd sat. "His father died thinking he'd failed," she said quietly. "I know." "That's the part that doesn't get fixed," she said. "The money comes back. The land value comes back. But what a man carries to his deathbed—" She stopped. Nathaniel looked at her. "Your father." "My father died knowing he'd found the truth and couldn't make anyone listen," she said. "That's what he carried." She was very still. "I'd like it. I would very much like it if this proceeding puts it on official record that William Bennett was right. Not just right in our house, not just right among ourselves. On federal record." "Crane," Nathaniel said without looking away from her. "Already planned for," Crane said quietly. "The federal complaint specifically references Bennett's contemporaneous documentation as foundational evidence. His name will be in the record as a witness who attempted to report the fraud and was suppressed." He paused. "It will be a matter of federal record." Clara looked at Crane. She nodded once. The small, definitive nod. Then she looked at her hands. And for just a moment, the briefest, most private moment, something in her face shifted, opened. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Nathaniel saw it. He didn't say anything. Some things didn't need words put to them. Some things needed only to be witnessed. He witnessed it. Outside, the Virginia summer pressed on the heat, the long afternoons, the fields going gold at the edges. Life continuing in its ordinary way, around the extraordinary things that sometimes happened inside it. In the estate office, a new accountant was starting on Monday. In 8 homes around the county, letters were being drafted to women who would receive, after 12 years of absence, the $20 a year that a dead man's generosity had set aside for them. In Richmond, a federal examiner was working through the contents of a frozen account that told in numbers the full shape of what one careful, patient, terrible man had built in the shadow of a trusted name. And in the library at Whitmore Hall, a seamstress in a faded blue dress sat at the table with a tin box in front of her and looked at a man who had finally completely opened his eyes. "You said ask you again when the work is done," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. "It's not done yet," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's further along than it was." She almost smiled. "Ask me again, Nathaniel." "When?" She stood and picked up the tin box lighter now somehow than it had been when she carried it through his door. "When my father's name is in the federal record. When the Greer family has their payment. When the widows have their letters." She looked at him one last time. "Then ask me." She walked out into the summer afternoon. He watched her go, and for the first time in a very long time, Nathaniel Whitmore was not thinking about the past. The letters went out on a Tuesday. 8 letters, 1 for each widow. Crane had been able to locate through the estate records and county documentation. Gerald wrote them in his careful hand, and Nathaniel signed each one personally. They did not say much. They explained plainly that a fund established by the Whitmore family had not been properly administered for a number of years due to an error that was now being corrected. They stated the amount owed. They stated that payment would be delivered by a state writer within the week in cash with no conditions attached. They did not name Everett. The federal proceeding would do that. The letters were plain and honest, and they said what they needed to say, and they went out on a Tuesday morning with 8 writers. By Thursday, 5 of the 8 writers had returned with responses. Gerald brought them to Nathaniel in the library, carrying them with both hands, the way he'd been carrying important things all week carefully, as if the weight in them was not entirely physical. Nathaniel read them at the table. 3 were brief. "Thank you. God bless you." One woman had written only, "I always believed the Whitmores were good people. I am glad to know I was not wrong." The 4th letter was longer. It was from a woman named Martha Selden, whose husband had died in a field accident on the eastern parcel in the winter of 1808. She wrote in large, unsteady handwriting that had clearly once been better and had gotten harder to control with age. She wrote that she had received the notice of her fund payment in 1809, and then had never received the money. And when she had inquired at the estate office, she had been told by a very polite and very firm man that the record showed payment had been made, and there was nothing further to discuss. She wrote, "I thought I had lost my mind. I thought perhaps I had misunderstood. I was 40 years old and my husband was dead, and a man I had never met told me I was mistaken about money I had never received, and because he said it so confidently and sat in that large house and wore that good coat, I believed him instead of myself." She wrote, "I want you to know that believing him instead of myself cost me more than the money." Nathaniel read that sentence twice. He folded the letter. He set it on top of the others. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table, pressing down. Then he got up and went to find Clara. She was not at the house. She had not been at the house since she'd walked out of the library 4 days ago, telling him to ask her again when the work was done. He hadn't seen her since. He'd been respecting it, respecting her terms, giving the distance she'd set. He went to her mother's place above the dry goods store. Ellen Bennett opened the door. She looked at his face, and then she looked behind her and said, "Clara, it's him." Clara appeared. She was in a work dress, her hair pinned up with less than usual precision, a spool of dark thread still in one hand from whatever she'd been doing. She looked at him the way she always looked, directly without pretense, adding something up. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat at the small table. He did not wait for tea. He told her about Martha Selden's letter. He read it to her, the whole thing, because it deserved to be read aloud, and he couldn't think of anyone else who should hear it first. When he finished, the small room was very quiet. Ellen Bennett, sitting in the chair by the window with her mending in her lap, had stopped mending. She was looking at the floor. Clara was looking at Nathaniel. "She believed him instead of herself," Clara said, very quietly. "Yes, because he had the big house and the good coat." She set the thread spool on the table. "My mother did the same thing. She couldn't read the document he put in front of her, and she signed it because he was so certain, and she was so—" She stopped. She was so alone. Ellen made a small sound. Not a word. Just the sound a person makes when a truth lands precisely on an old wound. Clara looked at her mother. Something moved between them, the particular communication of 2 women who have carried the same weight and know every contour of it. "I want to write to her," Clara said. "Martha Selden, not an estate letter. From me. From one woman to another." She looked at Nathaniel. "Is that all right?" "It's more than all right," he said. "It's the right thing." She nodded. Then she looked at him with the measuring look, the accounting look, and said, "Why did you come here to read that letter to me instead of sending it over?" He held her gaze. "Because it needed to be read in person. Because some things shouldn't travel alone." Clara was quiet for a moment. "The federal record," she said. "Crane's filing is my father's name in it. Yes, I received confirmation this morning. The preliminary federal record names William Bennett as a material witness who identified the fraud in its early stages and attempted to report it through proper channels. His documentation is cited as foundational evidence." He paused. "His name is in the record, Clara, on the right side of it." She looked at her hands. She was very still for 3 or 4 seconds, the kind of stillness that isn't absence, but presence, a person being fully inside a moment. Then she looked up at her mother. "Mama," she said, "Papa was right." Ellen Bennett looked up from the floor. "He was right," Clara said again. "And it's in the federal record now. It's official. It's—" Her voice held steady. just barely. It's there. Ellen's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together hard. She breathed through her nose for a moment, and then she said with the particular dignity of a woman who had been holding something for 4 years and was only now allowing herself to put it down, "I knew he was right. I never stopped knowing." "I know, Mama. I just needed someone else to say it where it counted." "I know." Nathaniel sat at the table and did not speak, because nothing he could say would improve on what was happening in that room. And he had learned somewhere in the last 10 days when to be quiet. When Ellen had composed herself, she looked at Nathaniel with the sharp eyes she'd used on him the first time he'd come through her door. "You're going to ask my daughter something," she said. It wasn't a question. "I intend to," he said. "She'll make you wait until every last thing is done. That's how she is." Ellen picked up her mending. "She gets it from her father. He never celebrated anything until all the columns balanced." A pause. "Ask her anyway. The waiting is her way of being certain. It doesn't mean the answer is no." Clara looked at her mother. "Mama." "I'm old," Ellen said placidly. "I get to say things." Nathaniel looked at Clara. She was somewhere between exasperation and something warmer, and the warmer thing was winning. "The Greer payment," she said, redirecting with the precision of a woman who knew exactly when to change the subject. "Is it done?" "Gerald is drafting the final transfer document today. Samuel Greer will receive it by end of week." The other 3 families from the fraudulent transfers. 2 located. 1 meeting scheduled for Monday. The 3rd family's eldest son is in Kentucky. Gerald has written. "We're waiting." The Richmond account freeze. Still holding. Crane expects the federal examiner's formal assessment within the month. Everett. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. In Richmond. Cooperating with the inquiry as Crane predicted. His attorney is building a defense around the argument that the estate's complex structure led to unintentional misallocation. He paused. The forged signature makes that argument very difficult to sustain. "Good," Clara said, simply. No elaboration. Just the flat, clear word of a woman who had waited 4 years to say it and intended to say it without decoration. The following Monday brought the second family meeting a man named Robert Carey, whose grandmother had lost a parcel of bottomland on the southwestern edge of the Whitmore estate in a transfer documented as a default in 1811. Robert Carey was 37, a school teacher, and he arrived at Whitmore Hall in clothes that were clean and carefully pressed in the way of someone who does not have many good things, but treats the good things they have with respect. Clara was there again. Nathaniel had stopped formally inviting her and started simply telling her what time to arrive, which she had begun doing without comment, which he took as a positive development. Robert Carey sat across the table and listened to the full account with the stillness of a man who teaches children how to sit and listen, and has learned the habit himself. When Nathaniel finished, Robert looked at Gerald's documents, then at Crane's summary, then at Clara. "You're the seamstress," he said. "The one who walked into the room with 30 women." Clara looked at him carefully. "Who told you that room?" "Mrs. Alderton," he said. "She's been talking about it. She says—" A small pause. "She says you answered a question about a hungry child, and it was the first honest thing said in that house in years." He looked at Nathaniel. "She was not being complimentary about the house when she said it." "No," Nathaniel said. "I don't imagine she was." "She's been telling people about the investigation too," Robert said, quietly, "to the right people." He paused. "I think you have more allies in this county than you know, Mr. Whitmore. People have had their suspicions about Everett for years. They just needed—" "Someone to look," Clara said. Robert nodded at her. "Yes, ma'am." Nathaniel looked at Clara when Robert Carey said ma'am to her, because the word landed differently when it came from a man addressing her at this table, in this room, as someone whose presence here was simply assumed and correct. She didn't appear to notice. Or she noticed and didn't show it, which was more likely. After Robert left with Gerald's commitment that the bottomland value and accumulated interest would be delivered within the fortnight, Nathaniel and Clara were alone in the library for the first time in several days. She was looking at the table. at the cleared surface where so many documents had been laid out over the past week and a half now bare. "Mrs. Alderton has been talking," she said. "Apparently. That will help the proceedings. Public sentiment." "It will." He watched her. "She said you answered the first honest thing said in this house in years. She said it as a criticism of you." "She was right to," he said. "I told you that from the beginning." Clara looked at him. "You're very committed to holding yourself accountable." "I reckon I have to be," he said. "If I stop, you'll do it for me, and you'll be less gentle about it." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, a real laugh, short and genuine, surprised out of her. It changed her face entirely, not because it made her prettier, though it did, because it made her fully present in a way that was different from the careful, measured presence she usually brought to rooms. She looked slightly startled by it herself. "I do not apologize for that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." They stood on either side of the bare table and looked at each other, and the thing that had been building between them for 10 days, carefully, practically through documents and meetings and a tin box and letters from widows and a dead man's right to be believed, was present in the room with them like a third person. It was not comfortable. It was not the romance of drawing rooms and well-lit parlors. It was something that had been earned through work and honesty and the particular intimacy of two people who had sat across from each other at the worst moments and had not looked away. "Clara," he said. "The columns aren't balanced yet," she said. "I know. The Greer payment isn't final. The third transfer family hasn't been located. The Richmond account is still in proceeding. The widows haven't all confirmed receipt." She met his gaze. "And my father's name in the record isn't the same as justice being complete." "I know all of that," he said. "And it will all be done. Every piece of it." He didn't move from his side of the table. "I'm not asking you to let go of any of it. I'm asking you to let me stand alongside it with you." She looked at him for a long, clear moment. "You know what I came through that door carrying," she said. "I know. You know what my family lost." "Yes. And you know what it cost my father to be right and unheard." Her voice was steady. "You know all of that." "I do," he said. "And I know what it cost you to carry it for 4 years before someone listened." He held her gaze. "I'm listening now, Clara. I've been listening since the morning you walked through my door, and I intend to keep listening." She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she said, "Ask me." He went very still. "Are you sure?" "I told you I'd have an answer ready," she said. "Ask me." He came around the table. He did not make it dramatic. He moved the way he'd moved through everything with her, directly, without performance. He stood in front of her, and he looked at her with the same honest, open attention he'd been looking at her with since 9 o'clock on the morning she'd walked in uninvited and told him a hungry child wasn't a crime. It was the evidence of one. "Clara Bennett," he said. "Will you stay? Not as a witness, not as an investigator, not as the woman who brought the papers that broke the case. As my partner. Equal standing. Your name beside mine on every decision this house makes going forward." He paused. "Will you stay?" Clara looked at him. The room was very quiet. Outside, the Virginia summer was continuing its business. The heat, the fields, the James River running low, all of it going on exactly as it had before any of this began, and exactly as it would after. Life did not pause for the moments that changed it. It just kept moving, and the moments had to find their place inside it. "Yes," Clara said, simply, the same way she said everything, without ornament, without performance, with the full weight of what the word meant behind it. "Yes, Nathaniel, I'll stay." He took her hand. Not with great ceremony, just held it the way you hold something you intend to take care of. She let him. 3 weeks later, the federal examiner issued his formal assessment of the Whitmore estate fraud case. The assessment ran to 47 pages. It documented 12 years of systematic theft through fraudulent land transfers, misappropriated relief funds, forged authorizations, and the deliberate suppression of at least 2 separate attempts to report the fraud through legitimate channels. It named Charles Everett as the primary actor. It named Philip Sorrell as his Richmond accomplice. It cited several local officials, including 2 land commissioners, as having signed off on fraudulent transfers, though it noted that the evidence did not conclusively establish criminal knowledge on their part. They appeared to have been deceived rather than complicit. It named William Bennett 16 times. Every instance was on the right side of the record. Clara read the assessment at the library table at Whitmore Hall, which was now a table she sat at regularly, whose surface she knew, whose particular afternoon light she had learned the shape of. She read it slowly, beginning to end. When she reached the first mention of her father's name, she stopped. She sat with it for a moment. Then she kept reading. When she finished, she set it down. Nathaniel was watching her. He'd read it the night before when the courier arrived, and he'd been watching her read it for the last hour, and he had not said a word. 16 times, she said. 16 times, he confirmed. In a federal document. That will be part of the public record permanently. Clara looked at the assessment. At the 47 pages of official, permanent, unambiguous truth. He was right, she said for the second time. The first time she'd said it to her mother. This time, she said it to the room, to the record, to the particular quality of late afternoon light that her father had never sat in. He was right, and it's on paper, and nobody can take it back. Nobody can take it back, Nathaniel said. She stood up. She walked to the window, not to look out of it, just to have somewhere to put herself while she felt what she was feeling, which was large and complicated and had been waiting a very long time to arrive. Nathaniel gave her the space. After a moment, she said without turning around, "My brother needs to know. Write to him today. Use estate paper. It carries more weight when it arrives on estate paper." She turned. She looked at him across the room. "You think of things like that. Practical things," he said. "You handle the important ones." She came back to the table. She sat. She pulled a piece of paper toward her and picked up a pen. She wrote to her brother, 14 years old, working in a mill, doing what their mother had asked him to do without complaint and without the full understanding of why. She wrote to him the way you write to a 14-year-old who has been cheated out of something he should have had, which is directly and without false comfort. She told him that their father had been right. She told him that it was now official. She told him that when this was all settled, there would be money for his schooling because the estate owed their family that, and the estate was going to pay it. She told him their father's name was in the federal record on the right side. She signed it with her name, and then because it was estate paper and she had equal standing and she intended to use it, she added the Whitmore Hall address below her signature. She folded it and handed it to Nathaniel. He looked at it. At her name. At the address. "I'll have it sent today," he said. "Good." She straightened. "Now, the third transfer family. Has the rider come back from Kentucky?" Nathaniel almost smiled. "Letter arrived this morning. The son is willing to meet. He'll be here in 2 weeks." "Good." She pulled the estate account summary toward her. She had been reviewing the estate accounts alongside the new accountant, a young man named Peters, who had the good sense to ask questions rather than assume answers. "Then we have time to finish the carry payment verification before he arrives." She opened the summary. Peters flagged a discrepancy in the November 1812 records that I want to look at before we close that file. "Clara." She looked up. "We'll get to the accounts," he said. "We'll get to all of it, but for 5 minutes. He sat down across from her, not behind any formality, just across. "Can you just let this be what it is? For 5 minutes." She looked at him. Then slowly she set the account summary down. 5 minutes, she said. "What does it feel like?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. She always thought about things honestly. It was the most reliable thing about her. "Like putting a stone down," she said. "A stone you've been carrying so long, you forgot your hand was shaped around it." She turned her palm up on the table, fingers open. "Like this. Like just opening." Nathaniel looked at her open hand. He reached across and placed his hand over hers. Just rested it there. No ceremony. No theater. Just the plain, warm human fact of it. She looked at their hands. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He would have needed 3 weeks to say so, but he would have." "I would have been glad to know him," Nathaniel said. "I think he would have told me several things I needed to hear. He would have been very direct about it." I gathered that from his margin notes. The almost smile appeared, then the real one, the short, genuine, surprised one that changed her face entirely. 5 minutes passed, then she picked up the account summary. "November 1812, she said. "Peters thinks it's a misallocation, but looking at the pattern matches the other false double entries," Nathaniel said, leaning over to look. "Same hand, same amount structure." "Yes, which means it's not Peters' error, it's another Everett entry. Add it to Crane's supplementary file. Already on the list." They worked. They beta. Outside, the summer afternoon moved toward evening, the way Virginia summers did. Slowly, warmly, the light going gold before it went. The fields stretched out beyond the house, the same fields they'd always been carrying, now a slightly different weight of history than they had before. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm. The third transfer family, a man named Daniel Holt, whose grandmother had lost bottomland in 1816, came from Kentucky on a Wednesday and left on a Thursday with Gerald's commitment and Nathaniel's personal apology, and the knowledge that the wrong would be addressed within the month. He was a quiet man, Daniel Holt, who said very little and listened very carefully, and at the end of the meeting shook Nathaniel's hand and then unexpectedly shook Clara's. "My grandmother always said an honest woman was worth more than a titled one," he said. "I reckon she was right." "Your grandmother sounds like she knew something," Clara said. "She knew most things," he said. "She didn't know how to hold on to land in the same county as Charles Everett, but that turned out not to be a failure of wisdom." He left. Clara watched him go and said nothing, and Nathaniel watched her not say anything, and understood that she was holding several things at once: satisfaction and grief, and the particular weight of justice that comes too late to fix the worst of what was broken, but arrives anyway and counts anyway and has to be enough. It was enough. It was not everything, but it was enough. Charles Everett's federal hearing was set for the first week of October. Crane came back to Whitmore Hall in September to prepare the final documentary submission. He arrived on a Tuesday morning and sat at the library table and looked at the work that had been done. The organized files, the clean summaries, the cross-referenced evidence assembled by Clara's hand and Gerald's and Nathaniel's over the past 2 months. And he said, with the quietly impressed air of a man who did not impress easily, "This is the most thoroughly documented fraud case I have put before a federal court in 40 years of practice." "Clara organized most of it," Nathaniel said. Crane looked at her. "Miss Bennett, or—" He paused, noticing something he hadn't noticed before. "Mrs. Whitmore." Clara looked at him with the composed expression of a woman who had decided how to answer this question some time ago. "Not yet," she said. "But soon. We wanted to wait until the court proceedings were finished." "A practical decision," Crane said. "She makes most of them," Nathaniel said. "I make all of them," Clara said, without heat, as a simple statement of organizational fact. Crane looked between them and made the small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. The federal hearing was not what people in the county expected. It was not dramatic in the way of popular imagination. No shouting, no breakdown, no single devastating moment of exposure. It was methodical. It was documented. It was the slow, thorough, unglamorous work of formal truth-telling, which is less exciting and more permanent than any dramatic scene. Crane presented the documentation over 2 days. The forged signatures were the center of it. Expert examiners from Richmond and Philadelphia had confirmed independently that the capital W in the Widow's Fund transfer authorization did not match the established signature of the late Elder Whitmore. Additional documents bearing the same forged hand were identified and entered into evidence, 7 in total. The Richmond account records obtained through the federal freeze showed 12 years of transfers from estate funds through Sorrell's office into the Everett and Sons account. The total was larger than the preliminary estimate, considerably larger. Philip Sorrell testified on the second day. His testimony was precisely as cooperative and self-serving as Crane had predicted. He confirmed the account structure. He confirmed Everett's instructions. He declined to characterize his own involvement as criminal, which was not his call to make. Everett's attorney argued misallocation complexity and the possibility of clerical error compounded over many years. He argued it well. He was a good attorney. It did not matter because a good argument against a forged signature is still an argument against a forged signature, and those only go one direction. Nathaniel was called as a witness and testified simply and factually about the estate, the discovery of the discrepancies and the findings of the investigation. He was asked how the investigation had begun. He said a woman delivering mended shirts had walked into his house and answered a question honestly when 30 others had not. The examining judge looked up from his papers. "I'm sorry, she came in delivering laundry." "Yes, sir," Nathaniel said. "Through the front door. We'd been expecting someone with a different kind of credential. It turned out the credential that mattered was that she was her father's daughter." The judge looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notes. Clara was called on the morning of the second day. She sat in the witness chair with the same contained composure she brought to everything. Her hands folded in her lap, her voice even. She was asked about her father's employment, about his finding of the discrepancies, about his attempt to report them, about the period following his death, about the loss of the family home, about the tin box. She answered everything directly and precisely, and without embellishment, the way her father had kept his ledgers, every entry accurate, every date confirmed, no number put down without certainty. When Crane asked her to describe the documents in the tin box, she described them exactly monthly copies, 11 years cross-referenced, annotated in her father's hand. Contemporaneous, unmanipulated, the real record set against the false one. "And your father kept these records," Crane said, "for 11 years in the regular course of his work." "Yes, sir," Clara said. "Why?" Clara looked at the court, at the judge, at the examiners, at the faces of the men assembled in formal authority over a truth that her father had carried in a tin box under a floorboard for the last years of his life. "Because he believed," she said, "that an honest man keeps his own record, not because he plans to use it, but because honesty ought to be able to prove itself if it ever has to." The room was very quiet. "Those were his exact words?" Crane asked. "Yes, sir," she said. "He told me when I was 15. I've remembered them ever since." William Bennett's words, spoken to his daughter in a modest house in Whitmore County when she was 15 years old, entered the federal record on the morning of October 9, 1817, as part of the testimony that secured the conviction of Charles Everett on 4 counts of federal fraud, 2 counts of document forgery, and 1 count of misappropriation of a charitable trust. The sentence was handed down 3 days after the hearing closed. Everett would serve time in federal prison. He would forfeit all assets connected to the Richmond account. He would be permanently barred from any fiduciary or estate management role. Sorrell received a lesser sentence in exchange for his cooperation, which was exactly what everyone had expected, which did not make it entirely satisfying, but which Crane noted was how the law worked and was on balance better than the alternative. Nathaniel received the sentence notice at the estate on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October. He read it. He set it down. He sent a rider to Clara's mother's house. She arrived within the hour. She read the notice. She set it down. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "It's done." "It's done," he said. She looked at the table, the bare library table, the same table where they'd first sat across from each other over a tin box and a lamp and the full weight of 12 years of crime and 4 years of waiting. "My father's name is in the record," she said. "Yes. The Greer family has their payment. Signed and delivered last month. The Holt family. Settlement finalized Tuesday. The Carey family. Done. The widows. All 8 confirmed receipt, including Martha Selden." Clara was quiet. "Everett is going to prison," she said. "Yes." "And my mother's house," she said. the one Everett had taken with a forged debt on a document her mother couldn't read. The tenant who has it now, Gerald said the lease is up in March. We've already discussed it, Nathaniel said. If your mother wants to go back to it, it's hers. Free and clear. Gerald is preparing the deed transfer. Clara looked at him. Her eyes were bright, not wet bright. The brightness of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down in the right place. Ask me, she said. Nathaniel looked at her. The columns are balanced. Every last one, she said. He did not make it more than it needed to be. He did not go down on a knee or produce something from a pocket or arrange the moment into something it wasn't. He just looked at her across the table, across all of it. The work, the truth, the months, the tin box, the conversation that had started. Because she'd walked through the wrong door with a bundle of mended shirts and answered a question nobody else had answered honestly. And he said, "Then marry me, Clara. Be my partner. Stand beside me in every room and tell me the truth for as long as you're willing." She did not hesitate. She had not hesitated since the morning she'd walked through his door. She had been careful and measured and patient and precise, but underneath all of it, she had never hesitated. The care was not uncertainty. The patience was not doubt. She had been doing her accounting, checking her columns, making certain that what she was walking into was solid ground. And now it was. Every column confirmed. Every figure verified. "Yes?" she said. "I'll marry you. And I'll tell you the truth for the rest of your life, Nathaniel Whitmore, whether you find it convenient or not." "I'm counting on it," he said. "I have been since 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in July, when you walked in uninvited and told me a hungry child wasn't a crime." "It's evidence," she said. "The evidence of what a house has failed to do." "I know," he said. "This house will not fail again." He reached across the table and she gave him her hand, open, unguarded, the fingers uncurled, the way she'd held her palm up when she'd described what justice felt like. Like putting a stone down. Like opening. He held it. Outside October had come to Virginia, the heat finally broken the fields. Going gold, the mornings cool and clear, the river running full again after the long dry summer. Everything that had baked and suffered and waded through the heat was breathing now. Settling. Coming into the season that comes after endurance, when the air finally remembers how to be kind. Inside Whitmore Hall, the woman nobody had invited became the woman who changed everything. Not because she was rescued, not because someone powerful took pity on her, but because she had walked through a door with mud on her boots and the truth in a tin box, and the absolute unshakable conviction that honesty ought to be able to prove itself if it ever has to. It had. It had proven itself in 47 pages of federal record, in 8 letters to 8 widows, in the handshake of a man named Samuel Greer, in the schooling of a 14-year-old boy, who had worked in a mill long enough, in the return of a modest house, to a woman who had signed a document she couldn't read, because a man in a good coat had told her she had no choice. It had proven itself in all of that, and it had proven itself here in this room, at this table, in the plain word of a plain woman who had never once pretended to be anything other than exactly what she was. And the man who had tested 30 women looking for the truth had found it not in silk or pearls or practiced grace, but in a faded blue dress and mud-caked boots and a voice that said without apology, "Before you ask why the child stole, ask why the child was hungry." The answer had not just silenced the room. It had changed the house, restored the wronged, buried the lie, and built on the cleared and honest ground, where a long deception had finally been torn out by its roots, something that would last. That was what honesty could do, when someone with power finally chose to listen. And in Whitmore Hall, from that October forward, someone always would.